right, welcome everybody to the great debate series that we're doing here on Twitch. These are going to be a friendly meeting of minds. The dial of ideas is going to be turned up to 11, as I'm sure you're about to experience. The rules are as follows. We're going to have the whole thing kind of broken down in Oxford style, so the two opponents are going to have 5 minutes each to give their introductions, at which point, at any point, either member is allowed to state that they've spoken for the limit they like. So if it's a minute left, you can say, I relinquish the rest of my time. At which point we'll do, we're going to try doing some quick rebuttals back and forth. So we'll be doing a series of 10 2-minute rebuttals. And then we're going to open it up to some audience Q&A. If you want to ask any audience Q&A questions, just drop in my chat and at me. And then one of the mods is going to take a collection of the questions, and then we'll try to filter out the silly ones. And at which point you'll both have 5 minutes to close. Now, before we get started, though, we're going to give each of you 1 minute to introduce yourselves and, of course, plug anything you would like to. So why don't we start with you, Bastiat, on the left.
Sure. So, folks, my name is Bastiat. I'm a neoliberal corporate attorney, and when I say neoliberal, I really mean it. Not only do I work in the fossil fuel sector, but I work literally part of my job involves the proposals to deregulate industry. So I'm the real deal here, ladies and gentlemen, and I sure would appreciate if you'd like to check out our channel at twitch.tv/BASTIAT. That's a lot of fun. We talk about law and politics. Everybody's welcome from all perspectives, and we try and keep it a fun place to be. So I appreciate the chance to be here. It's good to meet you, Professor Burgis, and I look forward to the chat tonight.
All right. Yeah, it's good to meet you. So my name is Ben Burgis. I wrote a book called Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left, and which you can buy from places like Amazon, where Comrade Jeff Bezos will ship you a copy. And I do a regular weekly segment on the Michael Brooks Show called The Debunk, and a regular contributor to Jacobin Magazine. And also actually just had something published in Current Affairs, which is big for me because I really like that magazine. And but it just came out as I was preparing for this. I haven't even had a chance to look at it, but that's about Medicare for All. And also you can check out my Patreon for even more content, since in the neoliberal world that we're living in, we all have to be hustling our various gigs all the time. That's patreon.com/Ben Burgis.
Wow, perfectly under a minute. You got that down to a fine art, Ben. We didn't talk about this before. Who would like to start?
Well, I propose to, since I guess I was going to define the term as well. Although I figured that would be a point of pushback itself.
Well,
so,
okay. Well, why don't we do that? And I won't put any time on the clock, just so we can ground our moral axioms right out of the gates. Okay. So,
yeah. How about this? I'll okay. If you want to, since I weaved it into an introduction here, if you want to dock maybe a 2-minute rebuttal for me if I go over, I think this should be 5 minutes though total.
Okay, so. No problem. All right. Well, we will start with you, Bastiat. 5 minutes on the clock.
All right. Well, it's good to be here again. Thanks for your time, Lance. And ladies and gentlemen, neoliberalism is a term for the political and economic policies associated with free market, globalized capitalism. The term was popularized in the 1980s by American President Ronald Reagan, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, and, of course, economist Milton Friedman, who was perhaps the most influential economist of the second half of the 20th century. And it is in their transformative wake that the term remains relevant today. Its first use dates back to the Walter Lippmann Colloquium of 1938, a conference of intellectuals who met in Paris and aimed to build a new liberalism that could stand up against the collectivism of the fascists and the communists who were prevailing in the day. And it has taken its shape in this modern sense. Proponents of neoliberalism like myself see free markets and free trade as a foundation for human flourishing, creating the most favorable conditions for job growth, technological innovation, transnational collaborations that promote peace and global prosperity, trade deals, and individual freedom. We believe that government interference with free market systems generally, though not always, promotes waste and inefficiency and at a high level stagnation. We reject excessive regulations on industry, especially where they spare industries from competition where it should otherwise exist. So, for example, some key elements of this kind of deregulation is airlines, where we've seen success in lower rates and unbundling so that more people can fly at the price point that's right for them. Telecommunications, more innovation, gradual end of long-distance charges, and now these magic computer phones from space. And then energy, including electricity and natural gas in particular, where prices have declined and demand, especially for electricity, literacy in the U.S. is flattened. Other countries have different experiences. We also reject high taxation, especially corporate taxation, and certain public services that are not subject to market competition, and generally believe in shrinking the size of government in certain functions and limiting that size of government to the protection of private property through not just good policies, but law enforcement, facilitating global commerce, and maintaining a strong military. So to paraphrase Milton Friedman in describing neoliberalism from his foundational essay, Neoliberalism and Its Prospects, written in 1951, neoliberalism accepts the 19th century classical liberal emphasis on the fundamental importance of the individual, but instead of laissez-faire markets free of all restrictions as a means to this end, it pursues the goal of the competitive order. It would seek to use competition among producers to protect consumers from exploitation, competition among employers to protect workers and owners of property, and competition among consumers to protect the enterprises themselves. The state would police the system, establish conditions favorable to competition and prevent monopoly, provide a stable monetary framework, and relieve acute misery and distress. The citizens would be protected against the state by the existence of a free private market and against one another by the preservation of competition. Critics of neoliberalism argue chiefly that its policies exacerbate rather than mitigate economic and social inequalities. They cite the effects of unregulated capitalism and the reduction or removal of safety nets typically provided by governments to support those who are economically and socially vulnerable. Perhaps more fundamentally, many critics seem to assert that neoliberalism fails to account for so-called structural forms of violence, systemic poverty, racism, and other forms of oppression. They argue that these hinder access to the benefits of free market capitalism that neoliberals like myself imply and indeed believe can be universally shared. They claim that because neoliberalism fails to acknowledge structural forms of oppression, it blames individuals for their failures rather than the systemic inequality that leads to social and economic vulnerability. So to go back to Milton Friedman, neoliberalism recognizes the very real need to to relieve acute misery and distress. For example, as he said, the government would have the function in the ideal system of relieving this misery and distress. Our humanitarian sentiments demand that some provision should be made for those who draw blanks in the lottery of life, as it were. Our world has become too complicated and intertwined. We've become too sensitive to leave this function entirely to private charity. It is essential, however, that the performance of this function involve the minimum of interference with the market, the engine of innovation and prosperity that makes the relief of misery and distress possible in the first place. There's justification for subsidizing people, for example, because they are poor, or whether they're farmers or city dwellers, white or black, men or women, young or old, or anyone in between. But there's no justification for subsidizing, for example, farmers or steel producers simply because they are farmers and steel producers, rather than, again, because they're poor. These criticisms ultimately, therefore, depend on the nature of the welfare state designed to remediate these issues. America's welfare state, for example, is threadbare in many ways, and it doesn't cover healthcare except for select groups, chiefly saddling businesses with this responsibility of the rest of American healthcare to the detriment of all. So, for example, many neoliberals now believe that healthcare should be made universal in the USA, as in all of its peer countries. Corporate taxes, which are chiefly passed on to consumers anyway, should be cut. And most importantly, America's borders should be open permanently to the people of the entire world, increasing wealth radically for America as well as for other countries. So, therefore, the key to that reform and improvement is the wealth made possible by free trade and free markets in the neoliberal globalized world.
All right.
Sorry, before you start, Ben, do you agree with his definition of neoliberalism? Because he had to spend like at least a minute and a half defining that. So I think if that's the case, he should probably get like at least an additional minute back or something to that effect.
That's pretty much everything I had to say. I don't need any more time for that.
Okay.
I mean, I guess, I heard a lot of that definition. I'm not sure I disagree with it. I might put emphasis in different places.
Okay,
neoliberalism.
Oh, sorry. I was like, do you want to just go for the 5 minutes then, or?
Okay.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll start the clock now.
Yeah. So I would think of neoliberalism as the revival as a global trend in the last few decades. So revival, hence neo, of less social democratic and more laissez-faire ways, hence liberal ways of managing capitalism. Which might be approximately equivalent to what we just heard. I certainly don't want to stress the definition too much. In any case, why do I have such a problem with neoliberalism? Well, first, because it causes entirely avoidable human misery. I'm talking about everything from people who die sooner because of lack of health care, although from what we heard at the end there might be some agreement on that subject, to people who die sooner because of financial stress and all the medical conditions that brings about, to people who live long lives that they don't get to spend nearly enough of with their families or pursuing projects of their own choosing. because they have to work all the time, and every spare room in the house has been rented out through Airbnb. And on the off chance they do have a spare evening, they have to spend it polishing up their CV. Neoliberalism leads to the Uberification of everything, the precaritization of everything, the adjunctification and gigification of everything. So ordinary people can have the delightful experience of both getting the downsides of being a powerless worker under the thumb of a boss and the downsides of living the kind of life we normally associate with struggling small business owners who have to hustle all the time to promote their business. In this case, your business is just your labor power as anything from an Uber driver to an adjunct professor. Neoliberalism undermines human flourishing by giving everyone less free time and less headspace to devote to their non-economic lives. Neoliberalism is not, in the most important sense of the term, all that liberal. In other words, it doesn't promote the most meaningful kinds of human freedom. So, for example, the fewer protections you have against being arbitrarily fired, the more you have to worry about what your boss will think before you do anything from getting a tattoo to joining a controversial political organization. The more you have to bounce from gig to gig, the more you have to worry before you post something controversial on social media, because any number of potential bosses might see it. So I think neoliberalism undermines freedom. Finally, neoliberalism undermines democracy. If you don't believe that one, ask yourself how many countries with state-owned oil companies have ever decided by referendum to privatize them. How about other important public resources? Conversely, how many democratically elected governments in the third world have experienced military coups or American aggression because they've nationalized their oil industry or engaged in other insufficiently liberal economic policies? I'm not just talking about classics like Iran in 1953 or Guatemala in 1954, which you might dismiss as ancient history from the Cold War. Recent examples include Venezuela in 2002, the removal of Aristide in Haiti by U.S. Marines in 2004, the coup in Honduras in 2009, the slow-motion overthrow of the Workers' Party in Brazil from 2016 to 18 by corrupt judicial maneuvers coordinated with the United States, the second attempted coup in Venezuela in 2018, the successful one in Bolivia a couple months ago, and the list goes on and on. It's obscene. The same way that the most inarguably persuasive condemnation of Stalinism was the Berlin Wall. My God, they need to resort to barbed wire and armed guards to stop their citizens from escaping. This litany of horrors I've been recounting, this track record of coups, invasions, and other forms of undemocratic aggression against countries of the global south that try to escape from the dubious benefits of the neoliberal global order, stands as a pretty persuasive argument that this system, this form of capitalism that's increasingly liberal in the sense of letting the owners do what they want and increasingly illiberal and precarious for the rest of us, is not the best we can do. I relinquish the rest of my time.
Okay, we're now going to move on to the first of the rebuttals. We're going to put 2 minutes on the clock for you, Bastiat, beginning now.
Okay, so there were it seemed to me, two key elements of what you were talking about there. First, the notion of that which neoliberalism's effect on individual human flourishing, and then foreign policy. So I'll try and take it in those two senses. First, everything you discussed as far as individual human flourishing is something that is one, I would contest completely, or I would say is the job of a welfare state, where in Europe those problems have been addressed more helpfully through welfare states, especially in the Scandinavian countries, and where in the United States, to the extent those problems haven't been addressed, it seems to be due to the peculiarities of American government rather than to neoliberalism generally. So, for example, when you talk about, when you mentioned public spending, right? The European Union, fundamentally neoliberal project, right? Nevertheless, this figure may be a little different today now that Great Britain has signed its exit of the European Union. But nevertheless, the European Union, with 7% of the world's population, constitutes 50% of its public spending. And this European Union, which represents the kind of fundamental free trade, open borders, global capitalism that I'm talking about here, is nevertheless buttressed by a often described as very very successful welfare state. The other notion that you mentioned was kind of the gigification of the economy, but it seems to me that that is ultimately a very important question as far as perspective goes. What you describe as constant work and constant, really the loss of opportunities, seems to me to be a kind of a new opportunity for people of all different stripes to engage in new and different kinds of work. I mean, Twitch, for example, is one example of that. But when you talk about Airbnb, I mean, that's a way that people can maximize the use of a scarce resource, right? Hotel space, housing space, things like that. And I'll address foreign policy in the other rebuttal. But ultimately, what you talk about is less free time, more work. Ultimately, sounds like more opportunities to maximize your personal welfare.
That's time. On to you, Ben. 2 minutes.
All right. Well, I have to say I'm a little confused about the claim about welfare states, because it strikes me that when we're talking about neoliberalism, welfare states is one of the primary things that we're talking about, right? In fact, in your opening salvo about neoliberalism, we heard a lot about how welfare states should be smaller in various ways. That they have there might be some legitimate role for government, right? But it should be reduced. It should be means tested. I heard people deserve support because they're poor, right? So I would think that when we're talking about that, what we're talking about when we talk about neoliberalism is to a great extent the difference between some of those EU countries that, as much as the EU might in a sense be a neoliberal project, still have much more regulations on what bosses can do to workers, still have much stronger labor unions, and still have universal social programs that greatly increase the size of government in precisely a way that means that people don't have to enjoy the dubious benefits of those opportunities to find new ways to rent out their homes or rent out their time, or scrape by because they can get by just fine with one job.
Yeah, and indeed, it would be great if anybody who wanted to, I guess, get by just fine with one job could do so. And indeed, in large measure, most people still can. But to the extent people want to maximize their welfare by doing other things like engaging in this gig economy, I think that's a good thing. But as far as the welfare state goes, here's, I think, the fundamental difference in terms of types of welfare states. When we talk about a welfare state, I think, to me, first of all, I have no objection to universal programs, although it depends upon the design of the universal program and the need that is trying to be met. I know, for example, you described universal basic income as Yang Bucks during your debate with Rage Pope. I think that actually, the kind of guaranteed income seems like a good example of a good universal program that maximizes the individual's freedom and nevertheless also accounts for poverty in society. Maybe you disagree with the Yang form, but there are a variety of proposals for that. So I don't think that neoliberalism, that is to say free trade, open borders, global capitalism, rubs up against that. Now, there are certainly different flavors of it, but I think by and large, the key elements of it, free trade, open borders, at least for goods, ideally for people as well, and global capitalism doesn't have to come at the expense of that. It depends on how you structure it. If you structure it in the way we do in the United States, where we've buttressed, for example, we've rather saddled businesses with the task of healthcare, then yeah, there are some good arguments that our current health system is broken. But if you can organize welfare programs in a different way, to which everybody contributes, and they don't restrict people in where they're at, that's a good thing. And then welfare also comes in many forms. It's important to remember. The Wall Street Journal released a great article called Boomer Socialism the other day, where they talked about how America's housing regulations have basically benefited those who already own houses and made it very difficult for people who want to buy houses to do so because they've driven the cost of housing up. That's one example of the kind of regulation that we'd like to drive out so that people have a chance to participate in what should otherwise be a competitive market.
All right, to you, Ben.
Yeah. So I think that as far as the welfare state goes, I'm hearing, I don't want to focus too much on that for the simple reason that I'm hearing a surprising amount of agreement. I don't normally think of nationalizing the American health insurance industry as a neoliberal position, but if you're willing to embrace it, I'm certainly not going to spurn the company in taking that position. As far as open borders go, I think there's a really crucial distinction to be made there, since of course neither the United States in the decades in which it's increasingly embraced what are usually thought of as the neoliberal economic policies, especially starting with Carter and Reagan, has certainly hasn't opened up borders for people. In fact, the trend has been in the opposite direction. It's closed them down and increasingly militarized the borders, through Clinton and Obama and Trump. And the EU, while it has internally, in a sense, maybe close enough, right, to open borders, is also has very non-open borders externally, and also has one of the reasons people think of the EU as a neoliberal project is because it's promoted the undermining of welfare states. So what seems to me that's really good in a lot of those EU countries is often stuff that predates, if not the European common market, certainly the EU being anything like it is now and having anything like the kind of influence on its member states' policies that it has now.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I would, and by the way, we definitely should get to the foreign policy at some point, but I wanted to talk about this stuff first. First of all, as far as healthcare goes, I'm not saying we should nationalize it, but I think you could have universal coverage without a nationalized system like they have in, for example, UK. Plenty of countries on the continent and East Asia, have healthcare systems that are universal but not nationalized. So that would be another example of drawing a line here with welfare. We wouldn't want to nationalize something if we could, for example, still preserve some private market, some private competition, and nevertheless have the government involved to the extent it needs to be involved for universal coverage. However that might work, there are a bunch of models out there in Europe and again in East Asia for that. But then as far as open borders go, I think, first of all, as far as ideal policies, I think it's worth talking about ideal policies. I mean, we, for example, here on Twitch have a very robust left wing that often talks about how socialism would work in various ways that have never actually been implemented, but which are interesting to discuss and worth noting. So I don't think it's worth writing that off. But as far as open borders go, frankly, the fact that we've got more restricted borders here in the Trump administration and the Obama administration, I think dovetails with the fact that also the Trump administration has been dialing back on tariffs. I mean, they are trying to retreat from this neoliberal world order and go back to good old-fashioned conservative isolationism. And so it's in that sense, it's that America First policy represents a retreat from the kind of policies I'd like to see. I think neoliberal policies. But even then, in the European Union, there have been exceptions to what you say. Germany's very gracious acceptance, and not just Germany, other countries there too, but Angela Merkel specifically accepted all of those Syrian refugees that fled war in the Middle East. So it's not to say that the European Union is fully open borders, as again, I as an American would like to see my country fully open with respect to its borders, but it is the best example of an open borders experiment in the world today, and is certainly worth consideration. Finally, I don't know, I'd be curious why you think the EU undermines European welfare states. The only argument I've heard to that effect is one, the euro, which could be dissected from the EU, and two, open immigration, for example, Polish plumbers, and things like that, used by British Brexit proponents as arguments for why the welfare state there is overburdened. So,
all right, Ben.
All right, to start at the end, I would look at Greece as the obvious example there, where the European institutions were very aggressive in imposing austerity. And again, I would also say that in general, the politicians that you would most closely associate with the neoliberal project, people like Macron in France, have been trying their best to undermine welfare states there. I think it's interesting to note that the correlation that you were drawing between Trump being more aggressive about immigration and undermining tariffs only really works if we're paying attention to the last little part of the history, right? If we're disregarding everything before that, because if we're looking at everything before that, we'd have to say that, okay, maybe there was a time in the 80s when immigration liberalization and neoliberal economic policies marched hand in hand, but certainly since then that hasn't been the case. That Bill Clinton, who pushed NAFTA through Congress, GATT, WTO, all that stuff, was also the one who first made border crossing a felony, and really implemented the current system of having two parallel legal systems for immigrants and non-immigrants, and the most aggressive deporter, just in terms of sheer numbers and in history up to that point, was Barack Obama, who was also promoting new free trade deals all the time, everywhere, whatever possible, and was surely a living embodiment of the triumph of neoliberalism in the Democratic Party.
Okay, back to you, Bastiat.
Okay. Yeah. Look, it is tragic the way that immigrants have been treated, not just by the Trump administration, but also by the Obama administration, and it sounds like the Clinton administration, although I'm less aware of immigration policy back then. But look, at the end of the day, we're talking about policies that we know are a good thing and we know that would work. So to the extent that you would dispute that open borders is a neoliberal policy, well, I mean, I guess we could have that discussion. But I'm making the point that we should have more open borders. And again, to the extent that we haven't, the problem is not that we've had too much neoliberalism; it's that we haven't had enough. So yeah, in that sense, I would like to roll back remaining tariffs. I'd like to get rid of them all completely. I'd like to open the borders of the United States to the entire world. So in the sense of addressing the question of is neoliberalism a force for good, then to the extent that that's a component of it, I think it is. It's just one that tragically hasn't been fully realized yet, and hopefully someday will. But let's see. You were talking about foreign policy as well. And I'd be curious where you make that tie between neoliberalism and foreign policy, because so much of what you described seems to be, the issue of bad American foreign policy can be fundamentally separated from the notion of free market capitalism. I mean, for example, America's interventions in the 20s and 30s in Latin America were motivated not by some kind of free market capitalism, but by a state, almost a state capture in a sense, motivating, the government acting on behalf of certain established interests rather than on behalf of a competitive free market. So to the extent that the U.S. government has not lived up to these ideals, again, that doesn't discredit the ideals. It discredits the United States government, which again, I'm happy to sell out when it is not an agent of human freedom. So, let's see here. We talk about, I'd like to know like how it is that you can tie all of these interventions to neoliberalism. And I'd also like to know, again, if the United States is indeed grinding up the entire world, why it hasn't succeeded in taking on Venezuela, for example, why it is so capable of organizing coups in some places like Brazil, which you mentioned, which, it seems very attenuated to blame on the United States. And yet Venezuela still continues to exist in its form.
Okay, Ben, do you guys want to add one more back and forth? Because these are kind of, they've been good and spicy. Or after this is going to be the 10th. Do you want to move on to audience Q&A?
Wow. Yeah, I thought we were just getting started.
Oh, you're just flying by?
All right.
But if you want, we can add a couple more. I mean, this is fun.
It's up to you, Ben. I'm enjoying it.
Yeah, let's add at least one more.
Okay.
So, all right. So, a couple things very fast. First of all, as far as the immigration question goes, is this a matter of is the tendency towards immigration restriction is a matter of too much neoliberalism or not enough neoliberalism? Well, I'd say that it depends on whether you're talking about a sort of theoretical neoliberalism or the real phenomenon. And I think that there's a theoretical way of conceiving or justifying neoliberalism, according to which, yeah, of course, open borders would be part of the package. But I think that given that real neoliberalism is all about corporate power grabs, I think it makes perfect sense that we would see at the same time as we've seen easing up on restrictions of the ability of companies to move south in terms of lower wages, we've also seen tightening of the ability of workers to move north in terms of hiring in search of higher wages. Both serve the same agenda. This brings us nicely to the comparison that was made about Twitch leftists supporting socialism but renouncing the Soviet Union or whatever. And what I would say is, as a socialist, all the things that I support, we can see lots and lots and lots of real life examples of them working together, at least a la carte, if not necessarily all at once, right? Workers' control, hey, Mondragon, right? Successful workers' cooperatives. Bigger, more universal welfare states with far less freedom by bosses to do whatever they want to workers. Look at the Nordic model. Look at so there's a great article in Current Affairs called by Nick Guarino called "The Data Shows That Socialism Works," where it ranks all the countries in the world by the degree to which they approximate various socialist ideals. The Nordics obviously come out on top, and all of these things work very, very nicely.
Okay, to you, Bastiat.
Yeah, sure. So if we're going to go a la carte, and I respect going a la carte here because, there's a great a la carte example of open borders immigration in the United States, and that is, say, the United States' immigration policy from the late 19th century to the early 20th century, with, again, the racist exception of the Chinese exclusion laws, was otherwise largely free, and the United States flourished from that. So there have certainly been times in history where this policy has existed in what, you could, I think, still in that time call the United States a liberal country, even if neoliberalism might not have been a fact by that point. So there's certainly
first-round liberalism.
First-round liberalism. That sounds good. As far as that goes, I'm curious, like the notion of the notion that the United States, or rather that neoliberalism requires exporting. The point you made about dovetailing of offshoring work and yet simultaneously trying to prevent people from coming into the United States. I mean, it seems like immigrants have been picked on and bashed on by just about every government in the history of the world. Tragically enough, they're an easy target, and I'm really curious about this notion that there is a correlation there. I don't see it. I mean, it seems like immigrants are bashed on because of in essence, parochial political considerations rather than out of a desire to keep the workers working in their cheap factories instead of coming here to the United States. I mean, typically the economic arguments against immigration here are about the wages of native citizens rather than, the notion that we're not going to keep people working in those countries if they come to work here. So I think that is a very tenuous point. And beyond that, I do want to make a point about the notion that you said about bosses and workers and the freedom of workers to make decisions. Look, part of individual freedom means not just the freedom of the worker, but also the freedom of the employer. For example, I think it's very reasonable that employers should be able to fire people that are members of very controversial political organizations. One of the best tools we have in the United States for fighting the alt-right is publicly shaming them and then having them fired. So I think that's a very good
10 seconds,
thing.
But I'm going to give you an extra 20 because Ben interrupted you. Sorry about that. But I'll
that's all good. So I think it's a very good thing that we have this kind of what would you call it? At-will employment, because generally it means more flexibility in the labor market. And again, assuming the government isn't putting its thumb on the scale in the opposite direction, more flexibility, less unemployment, especially among youth in the United States compared to Europe. So,
all right. Well, one obvious, of course, you're right that anti-immigrant xenophobia, can exist and often has existed separate from neoliberal economics. But there is one obvious connection between the two, which is that neoliberalism, creates conditions from which people are eager to flee, and thus waves of immigration. As far as flexibility goes. I think that's a kind of flexibility that's very good for a few people, right? It's very good for you if you're a business owner. It's very, very bad for you if, like, the overwhelming majority of the population, you have to work for a business owner for a living, because flexibility becomes a nice way of saying what you could also call precarity, lack of stability in your future, etc. All of which most people experience as very bad things. I have been a critic of the use of doxing as a tactic against the alt-right. I think it's short-sighted for leftists to reinforce the neo-feudal structure of American workplaces. And finally, when it comes to the question of the connection when it comes to foreign policy, the point is not, of course, that you can't support neoliberal economics and oppose coups against left-wing governments for which are, who have done things to anger the United States, like nationalizing key industries, or otherwise trying to buck the neoliberal order. Of course you can. You could also oppose the Berlin Wall and be a capital C communist. But in both cases, the fact that these systems need to resort to these things tells you something very significant.
Okay, that's time. Gentlemen, I'm going to move on to the audience Q&A because we have an overwhelming amount of questions from everybody, and some of them are pretty interesting, and I think it'll be fruitful to explore some of these, all right?
Sounds good.
Okay, so we'll start with the first one. With the collapse of finance and the housing market in 2008 from deregulation and other factors, with the failure of the American healthcare system as opposed to others, with the commodification of personal data and the lack of power of your data, how the hell can anyone think neoliberalism is a force for good and not a force for driving inequity? So obviously a bit of a loaded question, but I'll let you answer that one first, Bastiat, with 2 minutes on the clock.
Okay, so it was the healthcare, housing market, and okay. Yeah. Look, I mean, the data itself, for example, was given away in exchange for free services. So, like, to say that this data was just given away for nothing, first of all, is questionable. But second of all, the paralysis of our current government is an example of, again, the failure of American government, not neoliberalism, to address some of these pressing needs. Like, for example, there's certainly a place for consumer regulation and consumer protection. The question is how far you want to go. And so I think that is a debate that must always be had in context. For example, we used to regulate the airlines, not just in the sense of regulating them for health and safety, but regulating their prices. And as a result, we priced airlines out of the reach of most Americans. Now, most Americans, in the wake of airline deregulation, can afford to fly, not just because of a decrease in fares, but because fares have been unbundled, and therefore people can choose the kind of flight experience that they want. So, like this notion that there's no addressing some of these issues. I just don't agree with that. We could certainly address commodification data through reasonable regulations, and again through without having to do away with the notion of capitalism altogether. As far as the housing market goes, again, that was an example of more government intervention in markets. The American government trying to incentivize the purchase of homes rather than the government stepping away from the marketplace. But as it were, even in the wake of the housing market crisis, living standards in the United States have continued to rise unequally, indeed, and inequality remains an issue. But nevertheless, the living standards of all Americans, or almost all Americans, have continued to rise as a result of free trade, global capitalism, and the kind of market-based systems that we're talking about here. So for me, I think the question is not how do we replace neoliberalism, but rather how do we address these flaws? And I've talked about healthcare as one example of that, where there is indeed a need for some state intervention. But state intervention should only be reserved for those areas in which it is necessary, contextually or provably necessary, rather than as a first resort, because of course market solutions have driven the overwhelming amount of economic growth since the 1980s that we've seen around the world, and the corresponding reductions in poverty as well.
Okay, this one is to Ben. How have neoliberals affected South America for the worse? 2 minutes.
Yeah. So I think that that everything, obviously South America is a big place, and it depends, and a lot of this varies quite a bit, country by country. And there's a lot that, that I wouldn't and shouldn't claim, to be any kind of expert on here. But I'd say that, one obvious way in which it's affected South America for the worst is that the zeal to enforce it certainly has stopped them from experimenting with other paths forward. That certainly things like the attempts at experimenting with democratic socialism in Chile in the early 1970s. There's an interesting connection there, by the way, with Milton Friedman, who was mentioned in the opening statement on the other side. So I think that in general it's had a lot of the same bad effects that it's had in lots of places. So for example, the immiseration of farmers by as a result of free trade agreements. the fact that that people aren't allowed to use historically really the one tool that's been most effective in turning third world countries into first world countries, which is good old fashioned protectionism, a la South Korea.
All right, already said that. And to people in the chat asking, Ben Burgis is currently very, very sick, so that's where the breathing sounds are coming from. To Bastiat, should workers have regulated rights? Example, not allowed to unionize. If so, why? And then to Ben, should owners have regulated rights to their property? Example, gold miners have a right to profit, and if so, why? So we'll start with you, Bastiat, 2 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, sure. So I guess the question there chiefly involves unions and democratic workplaces. So one, just to be clear, I have no problem with a voluntarily organized democratic workplace. If you want to have one, I think you should be able to form one. I don't think the state should force existing workplaces to become democratic, quote unquote. So I'm not in favor of that. But I'm also not in favor of many of the laws that the United States has in place, which put the thumb on the scale in favor of employers rather than unions. I think that is another form of state interference that should be rolled back. And a great example of that are the right to work laws that prevail in, I think, about half the states in the country, maybe slightly more than half, which say, in effect, that a company can't, or rather an employee can't be forced to join a union as a condition of taking work, which, again, interferes in the contractual relationship between a union and a company. It should be between them to resolve whether or not that's a closed shop or an open shop or whatever, but the government shouldn't put its thumb on the scale in that sense. So yeah, and then as far as unionization goes, I think there's also a serious question as to whether some public institutions should have unions at all. Now, this is a very difficult question. It's not a one-size-fits-all thing, but for example, the police really shouldn't have any kind of union whatsoever. They have full state power and the backing of friendly legislatures. So to say that they should have a union on top of that, which encourages the worst things, that the worst of policing, I don't think that should be the case. But there are different cases in other institutions. So not anti-union, but anti-compelled union and compulsion to. Anti-compelled union and anti-measures that, again, where the government seeks to keep people out of unions. So,
okay, Ben, the question, and in this 2 minutes, you can also respond to something there if you wanted, but should owners have regulated rights to their property? Example, gold miners have the right to profits, and if so, why?
I'm not 100% sure I know what the questioner is thinking of as far as gold miners go.
Well, basically, it's about property ownership. Should a gold miner have the right to, we'll say if they own the property, for example, should the owner of that property have the right to exploit and sell the gold?
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Yeah.
No worries. So yeah, look, I do support all sorts of regulations on the rights of property owners. In fact, I mean, look, this is not really what this debate is about, but I'm certainly, no secret of my long-term, political goals. I'm a socialist. I want to rearrange the sort of general property relations that we have. I am, in fact, in favor of forcing workplaces to be democratic, which as was just mentioned. But as far as the immediate debate about neoliberalism, in other words, should we have, is it good that we have this trend towards more laissez-faire, right? Regulation of capitalism, right? But second round economic liberalism. Or is it better to have a more regulated, more social democratic form of capitalism? Then given those choices, I am very much in favor of the more regulated form, because the more that you limit so-called business freedom, right, the more that you limit, the freedom of bosses to run their own workplaces however they want,
I know you're excited.
The more you enhance the freedom of the vast majority of ordinary people in practice to live however they want.
All right, thank you. I accidentally pushed the button there. All right, on to the next question. Ask Bastiat if he thinks working places should be democratized, or is it up to the companies to do so?
I think he already answered that.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'll skip past that one. By conceding the need for public health care, is that not admitting the failure of neoliberalism?
No, not at all. It just concedes that markets, while are extensively worthwhile in most spheres of human activity, that doesn't mean they cover 100% of human activity. Indeed, nobody, I think, well, apart from our few anarcho-capitalists out there, makes the argument that you can literally privatize everything. At the very minimum, almost everybody can see you need your military, your police, and your courts to be public institutions rather than private institutions. So the notion that we might add, for example, healthcare to that, again, doesn't undermine because of unique factors related to healthcare, doesn't undermine the notion that markets are generally a good thing for most other provisions of most other goods. Like, for example, when the professor mentioned the immiseration of farmers as a result of neoliberalism, it's also, I think, and perhaps more persuasively, a result of the way in which the chief agents of neoliberalism, the United States and the European Union, nevertheless continue to subsidize their their farmers. And that is, to me, one of the shining examples of where we haven't gone far enough. Instead of letting markets work with respect to food, we keep them subsidized and in some cases nationalized on vague arguments about food supply or national security or things like that. The perpetual cry of the national security, the perpetual cry of the oppressor, right? So I think that I don't think that concedes anything. It just recognizes reality that markets are great. It's just that they don't cover 100% of human needs, but they cover the majority of them. And I do have to say to Professor Burgis, the way that you use the word rearrange really got me to use the word rearrange economic relations. I mean, what you're talking about is the expropriation of basically the property of millions of people. That's a heck of a rearrangement there. So, I mean, but beyond that, the notion that freedom of employers comes, the loss of freedom to employers comes at the benefit to the employees. The loss of economic freedom of employers essentially benefits the employees only in the sense that they have more free time because they are unemployed, both in the sense that it's harder to hire new employees and in the sense that new enterprises won't be started up where they might have otherwise been started up. So it's just, I don't think that's a realistic argument.
Do you want 2 minutes to respond to that, Ben?
Yeah.
Okay.
Empirically, there is a mountain of evidence that last part is just false. So we could go through any number of examples. One of the quickest ways is just to look at living standards, for example, in countries that have some of the most regulated markets, some of the most labor-friendly labor laws in the capitalist world. Certainly, the place where this claim is made the most, that regulation, that restrictions on what capitalists can do in terms of running their own little fiefdoms are going to come at the expense. Is going to lead to unemployment. This is usually made with regard to minimum wage, and that one is great because, as previously discussed in the last debate, there are at this point decades of research, really exhaustive meta studies showing that no, in fact, raising the minimum wage does not lead to more unemployment. And it's certainly not the case that every regulation that makes it harder to arbitrarily fire somebody or that enhances what workers have the freedom to do on the job is going to lead to more unemployment. That's a wild claim for which, if the burden of proof is very much on the person making it.
Well, I reject
do you
the
want to
notion.
respond to that? Oh,
Yeah. I reject the notion that's a wild claim. I mean, even the minimum wage, for example, I mean, it's easy to look at the jobs that aren't lost, but again, you have to think about the jobs that might not be created as a result of these programs. I mean, I'm not going to refight the minimum wage argument, but I think that the notion that this is just some wild claim that basically tying employers down with more regulations never comes at the expense of employment, I mean, that is a hotly debatable point. So at the very least, that is certainly open for discussion. And certainly, as far as countries with labor regulations goes, I mean, maybe you have some other ones in mind, but the Scandinavian countries, which we, I guess, would both agree are great examples of places that you would want to live, nevertheless are marked higher than the United States in terms of the ease of doing business. They're right up there with Singapore and Hong Kong in terms of the ease of doing business. So certainly making things easier for employers does not come at the expense, or does not necessarily come, depending on the regulations, at the expense of the workers, and indeed can come, as in some countries, at their benefit.
Do you want to respond to that, Ben?
Just very briefly.
Yeah, 1 minute.
1 minute's good. So yeah, very briefly, I'd say that that we shouldn't. That if to the extent that countries that are vastly more unionized than the United States is have vastly greater welfare states, reducing people's dependence on their employers, and where people have in fact much more freedom on the job, right? They're much less worried about about being fired arbitrarily than Americans are. To the extent that we don't have these, those are still rated highly for ease of doing business, I'd say that that is the sort of fact that undermines the case that giving workers greater freedom on the job by regulating the ability of employers to fire them is something that's going to have devastating economic consequences.
Do you want another minute, Bastiat, to respond to that, or?
No, I'll only say that the issue of unionization, to the extent the United States government has directly got involved to fight unionization, that is the kind of state interference I'd be against, the same way I'm against the notion of the state regulating airline prices. It is something the state should not do. It should let unions and corporations, companies, sell things on their own, peaceably. Of course, it should prevent them from doing violence against one another. But anyway.
Okay, I think we have time for maybe one or two audience questions before we're going to do the closers. Let's get one for you, Bastiat. Okay, so in 20 years, wages for workers have not gone up, especially not regarding inflation. More and more people need to work multiple jobs now due to neoliberal greed. So how will neoliberalism help them, Bastiat?
I reject the notion that it's due to neoliberal greed. Again, I mentioned a lot of bad government policies in place. For example, the United States broke an archaic healthcare system, which socializes about a third of the whole project and then leaves the other 2/3 to business or to individuals to resolve on their own in various ways, also tied down by government regulation, seems to represent the worst of all worlds. And so I know the Pew Research Center, for example, has made the point that a huge reason why a lot of the gains of economic growth in the United States have not gone to wages, or rather have only a small portion have gone to wages, is this issue of benefits and the fact that a lot of this money has been absorbed in paying for the same kinds of benefits with spiking healthcare costs in the United States, which are again double, I think, just about any other comparable peer country. So the issue of wages being flat, I think you can tie to that. You can also tie to the decline of labor unions, which again, to the extent the United States government is involved, or rather state governments as well, is involved in actively trying to suppress unions rather than letting the market, you might call it, of unionization work. Yeah, that's another problem. But I think that I wouldn't credit that to an issue of neoliberal greed. I would reference that as another example of bad government policy.
Okay, Ben, do you want to respond to any of that, or should we just move on to one more question for you?
Well, what I heard was we should have stronger unions and public health care. So I'm certainly not going to push back against that. I mean, like I could go forward and push for the rearranging, but I'll take what I can get.
I just to be clear, I don't want the state to push unions. I want the state to stop trying to stop unions. Which I think is something we can at least agree on there.
Fair enough.
Okay, well, I'm down for another question if you are.
Yeah, let's do one more, but we should move to the closing statement soon.
Okay.
All right. By conceding the need for public health care is not admitting the failure of neoliberalism.
I think I kind of answered that one.
Yeah,
right?
I think you answered that one too.
Yeah.
In 20 years, wages for workers have not gone up, especially not regarding inflation.
Did we just hear that?
Yeah, we did that one. An increase in the neoliberal fix. All these questions like, Bastiat, what about healthcare? Bastiat, what about healthcare? How can anyone ever have a fair opportunity in a neoliberal society with immense inequality? Neoliberalism doesn't exist in a vacuum. So how would you even close the gap going forward? Bastiat.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess if you're going to close the gap, you'd look at, certainly inequality is something that this society has to consider and deal with. I know, for example, America's tax code and the way it is written right now and the way that the IRS enforces it makes it very difficult to tax the wealthy. right? So I think it's very reasonable to say that we want to pay for some of these programs with indeed taxation of, I don't favor wealth taxes, but higher taxes on the income of the wealthy. I think we should lower our corporate tax rates in the way that they've done, again, in the Scandinavian countries, because those taxes are ultimately passed on to workers anyway. There's some debate as to whether you could ever bring them down to zero for a variety of reasons, but I think we should certainly lower those and tax individuals more directly. So if you want to reduce inequality, I mean, I think somebody at Davos said it. It's about taxing individuals rather than trying to restrict trade, rather than trying to restrict markets, rather than trying to restrict, and I know this is for the moment sadly theoretical, rather than trying to restrict immigration. So I think that, I mean, that's, if you want to deal with inequality, taxes and redistributive programs like the universal income that I often argue for, that Milton Friedman used to argue for, although his form was a little different. So I think that's how you deal with it.
All right, Ben, would you like to respond?
Well, I'm in favor of redistributive taxation. I also have a lot of other ideas about how to reduce inequality, but I don't want to get us too far off track.
Okay, well, I guess then, gentlemen, we'll move on to our 5-minute closing arguments. Bastiat, since you started, I believe Ben, I guess, will go first, and Bastiat, you'll have.
No, I think.
Or is it the other way around?
It's the other way around.
All right, I'm just a consummate professional today on our biggest debate yet. This is great.
Okay.
Bastiat, begin.
Okay. Just pull up my notes here. So, we talked a lot about all kinds of different issues today, but I think for me, the proof is fundamentally in the pudding. What is the world that we've created since the 1980s, the neoliberal heyday, this neoliberal hegemony like? And frankly, I know there's a lot of debate about some of the other elements of life in the world today, but I think, as far as poverty reduction goes, it's pretty clear. Any way you slice it, poverty is on the decline in the world today, and not just in say the Scandinavian countries, which I guess are again the gold standard of human flourishing, but in countries all around the world that have engaged in economic reform. And to the extent that countries have not, they have not seen those kinds of benefits. A great example of this in practice is the difference between how different countries in Eastern Europe performed after the end of socialism in the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. When countries in the Eastern Bloc reformed, they thrived. Estonia, the Baltic states, Poland, the Czech Republic, other states in Eastern Europe that engaged in comprehensive reforms, they saw comprehensive benefits. Countries, on the other hand, like Russia, Belarus, and the Ukraine, until very recently, who have not made much in the way of economic reforms, were still very closed societies, have not seen those kinds of benefits. Especially Russia, seems to be saved by its oil prices. So poverty in the world is on the decline. It's within visible reach, perhaps, of its end sometime this century. And I think that the world today has been defined by this neoliberal hegemony that I read so much about, the process of preparing for this debate. I will concede that this is indeed the policy that defines many of the economic relations between human beings today. And yet I think that is a wonderful thing. Not only because it has made goods so much cheaper, and indeed in the United States, when we talk about frozen wages, we should certainly talk about affordable goods as well. The price of all non-durable goods, virtually all non-durable goods, and many durable goods has gone down. In the United States, we've seen an increase in the cost of services like healthcare, which of course we've talked about. But goods, free trade has made them cheap beyond belief in the United States in many sectors. So we've seen serious improvements in living standards, and not just here. Again, in Europe, in the wider world writ large. Some of those countries that have seen those countries that have not seen those benefits have been those that have been closed off to the world, those that have engaged in various discredited economic experiments like Venezuela, which engaged not just in redistributive socialism, but cronyism in its oil industry and ultimately paid the price after the collapse of oil prices. So to say that these other alternative models have failed because of American intervention rather than ultimately failing under their own weight, I think is unreasonable. But I think it's a good thing that neoliberalism remains the dominant economic paradigm in the world today, because though it is not perfect, though we've still got staggering inequality to deal with, though we've got serious poverty in the world, though we've still got to deal with climate change, a liberal, free market, global capitalism, moderated by an active state that seeks not just to preserve property and freedom, but to relieve acute misery and distress is the best way to address the problems of mankind and to create the better world that we all aspire to. Indeed, the more peaceful world that we all aspire to, because, of course, to me, my favorite part about neoliberalism is the notion that free trade has brought more peace between more countries in the world today. So I think it's the key to a more prosperous and peaceful world. And in that sense, I think it is definitely a force for good.
All right. Thank you very much, Bastiat. On to you, Ben Burgis. 5 minutes on the clock.
Okay, I finished. I don't know if you can hear me. You there?
All right.
Lance?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh man, let me see if anybody else can hear us.
Yeah. No, I can hear you. I'm saying.
Oh, okay.
I'm saying we're moving on to Ben Burgis. Sorry.
Okay, you did. I think you might have been muted.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think you were muted for a minute.
Oh, this is fantastic. All right, Ben, on to you. 5 minutes.
All right. So, couple of quick points before I kind of get to the big argument at the end. So, first, it's just simply not true that poverty has gone down no matter how you slice it. This is actually an important thing to correct. When people talk about poverty reduction, what they generally talk about is, I believe, $3 a day as the standard for living in poverty. If you're above that, you're not living in poverty. And my understanding is that there's actually a very important debate about how to slice that. If you define if you're interested in percentage or number of people living below that standard, because if you're interested in percentage, then it has gone down. If you're interested in number of people, it's actually gone up. There's a case to be made. There's a good episode of this, the podcast Citations Needed, a while back, that what we should be interested in is number of people, because we should be interested in human suffering and not how that suffering should be described statistically. And also my understanding is that even the World Bank concedes that a more accurate standard would be something like $5 a day. And if you go to that, that undermines even the statistical claim. And possibly more important than any of that, by far and away, this poverty reduction has been happening in a single country overwhelmingly, which is China, which has a system that, we were arguing about last time. How exactly to describe it. It's a hybrid, but it certainly, I think, does not fulfill anybody's ideals of free market capitalism. There's still a heavy dose of shepherding by state planners at the top. They combines private capitalism with heavy doses of centralized planning. And also, when we talk about various countries in the world, I'm glad we agree that Norway, with its generous welfare state, massive chunk of the economy owned by sovereign wealth funds, strong unions, etc., is the gold standard. But I thought it was kind of funny in light of that to bring up Venezuela as an example of how illiberal policies lead to disaster, because whereas there's lots of room for reasonable people to argue about exactly what went wrong with Venezuela, how much we can blame sanctions, etc., as opposed to corruption and mismanagement in Venezuela, that's an argument worth having. But there's no arguing that Venezuela had an economic collapse because of too much socialism, because even at the height of Hugo Chavez's welfare state, the public sector in Venezuela made up a smaller percentage of the economy than the public sector in France, never mind Norway, which is a nice one-to-one point of comparison, because both countries have their public sector inflated by a state-owned oil company, or predominantly state-owned. Okay. But in my opening statement, I made 4 main arguments about neoliberalism. So I think it's important to, as you're evaluating this in your head, viewer, to think about how much any of them were undermined. I said that it's bad for human flourishing because most human beings do not like or benefit from the sort of flexibility or opportunities that are celebrated by proponents of the gig economy. For most people who experience these things, they would much rather be unionized taxi drivers who work reasonable shifts and etc. than they would be Uber drivers, for example. I talked about how it's bad for freedom because the less regulated workplaces are, the more you're worried about being arbitrarily fired, and hence the more you have to rely on your boss bosses' goodwill, and and worry about not doing things that'll piss them off. And I talked about how it was bad for democracy. And in the course of talking about how it was bad for democracy, I mentioned all sorts of coups. And yeah, we could argue about the extent of U.S. involvement in Brazil, but I hope we're not arguing about the extent of the Brazilian neoliberal right wing's involvement in Brazil. And I skipped the classic example, which was Chile in 1973, which is where which not only snuffed out democratic socialism, not only gave us a reign of terror, but also gave an opening for the Chicago Boys, which is why the Chileans today are sick and tired of what they've experienced in the last few decades. They're in open revolt, and one of the signs you see most often in the streets of Chile in the last few months, sometimes in Spanish, sometimes in English, is one I find incredibly inspiring. They say, neoliberalism was born here and it will die here. Well, let's hope so.
It's fun to dream.
Wow, that you ended like on the second there. All right, gentlemen, do you both want to? I'm going to give you 1 minute each to do some more promos and plugs and talk about yourselves.
Sure. So folks, if you want to keep on talking about this stuff, I'll be talking about it on my stream here. We're live now, twitch.tv/BASTIAT. I sure would appreciate it if you check us out sometime. I talk about these issues a lot. We talk about a lot of law and politics here on the stream. It's a lot of fun. And we do call-ins pretty regularly too. By the way, Professor Burgis, I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. And I would love to chat with you again sometime. Maybe an unstructured kind of chat. I enjoyed it. I feel like this is a really good format, I think, for civility, especially compared to a lot of formats on Twitch. But it would be fun to just kind of have a more conversational thing sometime too. So I'd enjoy that.
Sure.
Whenever you've got time for that.
Yep.
Beyond that, again, neoliberal corporate attorney here, streaming on Twitch from Sundays to Thursdays. It's a lot of fun. Be sure to check us out, and thank you all for your time.
Ben?
Yeah, I definitely had a lot of when Lance was pitching this to me, it was like, I disagree with him, about just about everything, but like I really like this guy. I really enjoy him, and I can definitely see that. I think this might have been the most fun I've had so far. Yeah,
I'm what Margaret Thatcher may have described as a man you can do business with. There's a Gorbachev reference there for anybody who's listening.
Fair enough. So as I mentioned earlier, you can see me in a pretty regular basis in Jacobin. Also have twice a month column at Arc Digital Media, and do the weekly debunks on the Michael Brooks Show. This is not a regular thing. It's a new thing, so I'm excited about it. That this is the first article I've had there. You can see me today in Current Affairs talking about one of the few things we actually agreed on today about healthcare. And you can also find me on the patreon.com/Ben Burgis, spelled Burgis, Burgis. And yeah, that's about it. Thank you again.
All right. Thank you so much, gentlemen.
Right on. And thank you, Lance, by the way, again. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah,
thanks again for the offer, and Lance for setting this up. And Lance was so good at just can you do it this time? Can you do it this time? Just slotting out and getting it right, and so I really appreciate that.
No, I appreciate both of you taking the time to do this. That was
and the great artwork,
awesome.
Of course.
Yeah, sorry about the boomer moments. All right, cheers, gentlemen. Did you enjoy what you just watched and now crave more nectar of the damned? Did you know that if you're watching on YouTube, you're only getting half the surfy experience? We upload all of our content commercial and censorship-free to our Patreon. Due to the general demonetization of our videos, we now upload half of our original content directly to those who can help us produce this show. Want even more nectar than that? Well, come join us at twitch.tv/TheSerfsTV, where we do weekly live streams, debates, interviews, AMAs, and more. If you're an Amazon Prime member, you can help support our show 100% free by subscribing to our Twitch channel. So come join us, be merry, and know that your support is helping us do great things. Like pay rent and eat. We would first and foremost like to thank our god, Nicholas Marx, we worship at your temple. We would like to thank our monarch, Elsie Hupp. Your generosity has made this entire thing possible. We would like to thank our lords, Ricky Pilgrim, I'm Raft, and Michaela Schmidt. You are the pillars of our organization. To our Knights of the Surf Table, Paul Parfit, Daniel Kahn, Fair Tahan, Clement Chutzkoff, Schizosaurus, Josh Mickelson, Dr. Zayas, Cooper Pilot, Andre Lynn Epperly, Dylan Bith, Terry, Todd Buckingham, Jed Lewis, Todd Lajeunesse.